Welcome, everyone, to the second of these interview live streams I've been doing. Obviously, you guys tuned in last weekend to talk to Colton Herta. And this weekend, or this week, I'm honored to introduce the Sports Business Journal's motorsport reporter. You've probably seen him either on my channel or on Twitter. Welcome to the channel, Adam Stern. It's an honor.
Thanks for having me on, Dave. It's a pleasure.
So I've got to ask this question right off the bat because otherwise they're going to roast me in the comments. Why are you always right?
Well, it's just to quote Floyd Mayweather, hard work and dedication. It's really just talking to people in the industry about things that are really going on. And obviously a lot of, I think, reporters in motorsports do that. I mean, I'm definitely not the only one who does that. And, there's definitely times I get beat depending on the story. I mean, there's no guarantee that I'm going to get a story first, especially, you go across some of the different series like IndyCar, F1, certainly F1, I just don't have I'm not going to those races, so, when they come to the US like COTA, I'll go, but, certainly F1, I have a lot of work to do, and IndyCar, there's a lot of great reporters, NASCAR as well. All the time there's things going on in NASCAR that I might not break. But in terms of why, I'm able to get stuff accurate, it's just checking with folks. You got to basically, there's all sorts of rumors that we hear on a daily basis about the industry, NASCAR, IndyCar, F1, you name it. And not all of them are right. So you can't just hear stuff and then go immediately report it. You got to hear stuff and go try and confirm it. And sometimes you got to hold back if you're not sure about it until you can confirm it. Or what also often ends up happening is sometimes you can't 100% confirm something, so you have to soften your wording. So if you don't know something is for a fact a done deal, you got to say this might be happening, or this could happen, or this is in the works, or things like that. So you just got to talk to people in the industry and really figure out what's going on. And you got to also build up a good kind of network of folks that you talk to. And sometimes you got to some of the news that happens, you kind of expect, like when IndyCar is working on a title sponsor, that's public knowledge. So it's a lot easier sometimes for things like that, as opposed to moves that come out of absolute left field, because the ones that come out of left field, then you have to have someone who really is giving you that first initial tip. And, in terms of trying to make that happen, that's just coming down to trying to have good relationships with people. So, I mean, it's hard work. You got to stay at it. There's always things going on, especially these days in motorsports. I mean, F1 and NASCAR are basically trying to reinvent themselves completely by 2021. So every time there's a change in that regard, there's news. So there's a ton of news going on right now in the motorsports business. And IndyCar has a lot going on as well, of course, on a million fronts. So I'm sure we'll talk about some of those tonight. So there's just a lot going on. And if you hear this stuff and are able to confirm it, then it writes itself.
That's a great introduction to our live viewers. We are indeed going to be talking IndyCar, NASCAR, F1. Plus, at the end of the show, like with the Colton Herta interview, we're going to be opening it up to you guys in the chat. I will be prioritizing the super chats. Obviously, those ones should get read first, but it's not going to be limited to the super chats. If I see something that looks particularly interesting, or a lot of you guys want to ask it in the regular chat, I'm sure we'll be able to ask Adam about that. Adam, the first question I want to ask you, though, is specifically about you. I know it's not always, or it's, as a journalist, it's never supposed to be about you. But since you've been one of the go-to guys as of recently for motorsports news, I do want to ask you, because you've been you excel so much at journalism. I'll spit it out eventually. What came first for you? What was the first love? Was it racing or was it journalism?
Honestly, I mean, it's a little bit of both. I mean, not to kind of waffle, but I mean, I did watch some racing growing up. It wasn't necessarily the only sport I watched or played. I played soccer growing up. That was kind of my thing growing up. But I certainly, watched racing at times. And so I was a big, everyone has the need for speed, I think, to an extent, some more than others, of course. And so I was definitely one of those people. And I liked racing. But it wasn't the only thing I watched necessarily growing up or attended, things like that. and kind of just got into communications and journalism. It wasn't something that I grew up necessarily saying I wanted to do for sure. It was just basically how I kind of ended up, and figuring that, I had an ability to maybe help out in that field or work in that field. And so kind of led to me going to VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia, and majoring in that in political science. And I knew I was going to work somewhere in, politics, business, sports, something like that. And it just kind of worked its way to where my first job out of college was working with Sports Business Daily, which is part of Sports Business Journal. It's kind of like our online site where we aggregate news. So I didn't necessarily start in kind of a beat reporter position like I am now, like the beat reporter for motorsports, but through just contributing in different ways. Eventually, when our last motorsports reporter left to go to the Wall Street Journal at the end of 2014, I essentially just got called out of the bullpen. But at the same time, I really wanted that opportunity when they gave it to me, because motorsports is a great, it's a great sport. The business side is absolutely fascinating. So it's kind of just the way it ended up, but I'm certainly thankful for it and enjoying working and racing.
That's interesting. I do want to follow up on that. Is that you have obviously the business background, but you also mentioned the political science background. How much does that factor into motorsports as a business, maybe versus some other sports that you've had a chance to kind of peek behind the curtain of?
Yeah, I mean, motorsports is very political. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I mean, you got all sorts of different factions. I mean, even just, basically in all these series, I mean, the way motorsports series are kind of set up, usually you have different stakeholders between the league, the tracks, the teams. They're not all owned by the same entity. And so that becomes very political. You have different factions going against each other and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, I think, some of those classes were fascinating in college. I enjoyed them. And, whether I'm absolutely applying them right now, I mean, it's tough to tell. But, certainly, you're right. There is a political element of motorsports, and a lot of negotiations, a lot of kind of people, putting out subliminal signals and all sorts of stuff that you see in politics. So, yeah, I think that probably plays into it to an extent. It's an interesting point.
So I guess that's a good segue as well to start talking about the business of racing. And I guess we're going to start with the NASCAR side of things, because there's a lot of business related things happening there. You mentioned the fact that NASCAR seems to be starting to angle themselves and position themselves to totally change their business model by the time we get around to 2021, 2022. And one of the things that broke, I believe, this week was that Monster Energy will no longer be the title sponsor exclusively for the Cup Series. As I understand it, based on your reporting, that they're going to a tiered system. I guess for some fans on this channel, I interpreted it as it will be similar to like the old Champ Car World Series, which was like Bridgestone presents the Champ Car World Series powered by Ford. It was a bit of a mouthful, but it seems like they're trying to diversify the amount of sponsors that are in there with their naming rights.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I compare it, if some people can allow this, to the NCAA or somewhat to the Olympics. So there's no brand associated with the Olympic names. Like, it's not the Bridgestone Olympics or the Bridgestone NCAA tournament or the Bridgestone NCAA, but a brand like Coca-Cola, Capital One, some of their top partners, Reese's, they added Uber Eats. Some of these brands, they get, top advertising assets related to the NCAA. Body Armor is now a partner. So, AT&T, I mean, we all saw that. That's a great example. AT&T was all over the place during the NCAA tournament this past March and early April. And they're not the title sponsor of the NCAA or March Madness, but they had all these advertising assets still. They had all the TV advertising, things, etc. So it's going to be somewhat similar for NASCAR. They're just going to go, from what I understand, to the NASCAR Cup Series, barring something unforeseen, just go to the NASCAR Cup Series. And they're going to still have brands involved in all sorts of ways. So they're going to have a three-tier system, and that top tier, those guys are going to receive the best assets in the industry. So, for example, one asset for these top tiers will be at least one, if not multiple, race entitlements. Obviously, camera visible signage at many of the races, if not all of the races, things like that. Obviously, they'll have digital social media, inventory, the like, hospitality. So it's just a way for NASCAR to kind of kind of spread their eggs into multiple baskets and not have them all in one with one title sponsor. When they lost Sprint, it took them pretty much 2 years to find a replacement with Monster. And on top of just the stress, I mean, I'm sure they spent millions of dollars flying around the country, pitching hundreds of companies, all these different things. And so they're trying to move to a system where they don't have to worry quite as much. And also, let's bear in mind that Monster has been working on these short-term deals, which is not good for stability. They did a 2-year deal to start. They did a 1-year extension after that. And now they were offering to do another 1-year extension to give NASCAR more time because there's some talk that, this is quite stressful for NASCAR. This is not something that is very easy for them to put together, and possibly they could use more time. But NASCAR decided to go ahead with it. But so I think it's a situation where Monster is happy with the sport and as of right now, happy with the deal clearly by offering to extend for another year. But NASCAR just wants to go to the system where it's easier for them to have a couple, 4 to 6 top tier partners. They're going to have a second tier and a third tier as well. And some of the details around how they're going to classify the different tiers are a little bit unclear at this point because they haven't announced them. They're still figuring these things out and landing these deals. So they're not ready to announce them quite yet. But they're going to go to this system where, in their mind, they possibly could make more revenue than what they had with one sponsor at this point, given what that had gone down to in terms of what it's worth, which was around $20 million annually for Monster. And on top of possibly more revenue, it kind of spreads out their risk and they don't have to be quite so reliant on one partner.
That actually, now that you've explained it, sounds remarkably similar to the Formula One model. Formula One.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah, they've never had a title sponsor, but you have partners like Santander, DHL, Heineken that have huge stakes in the sport and on their television.
That's exactly right.
There was a question here in the chat I wanted to get to because it's very relevant to what we just discussed. DC Comics Racing wants to know, we're talking a lot about the Cup Series. Would Trucks and Xfinity also head in that tiered direction for sponsorship opportunities?
It's a great question. I would say my understanding right now, without, nothing is done right now from what I understand or permanent. Trust me on that on several fronts. I mean, these guys are still figuring this system out. But that being said, my understanding right now is that unless something changes, the Camping World and Xfinity have deals that last for several more years. So unless they were able to get Xfinity and Camping World to agree to go to that new system and stop their entitlement of those lower tier series, right now they can't. NASCAR couldn't change that. So they can change this for the Premier Series because their title sponsor was working on a 1-year extension for this year, 2019. So they could, Monster doesn't have the right after 2019 to demand that they continue as title sponsor, whereas Xfinity and Camping World still do, or at this point it's Gander Outdoors, but Camping World Holdings is the ownership company. So I think for right now, I would look for the Xfinity Series and Gander Outdoors Truck Series to continue under those names for next 3 or 4 years, I think. But for most of those deals, maybe a little bit less. But actually come to think of it, I think Xfinity's deal is a 10-year deal, so theirs goes through 2024. So I think the Camping World Holdings Gander Outdoors deal goes through 2023 maybe or 2022. So those deals still have several more years on them. So I would think for those, they're going to continue under those names for a couple more years at least.
So continuing with this idea of NASCAR continuing to change how it does business, we saw a pretty big statement from them with their 2020 schedule. Was there anything? I mean, there were certainly a couple dates on there to me and other fans that really stood out as, wow, they really are changing some things, like moving Daytona to the last race before the playoffs, doing a Pocono doubleheader, ISM Raceway is the finale. Could you explain some of NASCAR's decision-making process on the 2020 schedule? Because I think there's a lot of questions up in the air still, even though they've gone out and given some explanations on why they thought it. I think there's still some people who are kind of like, well, what are they thinking here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, starting with the last race of the season, I think that's a clear indication that they're going to start trying to look to rotate that, in kind of like a Super Bowl type rotation. So, I mean, they're only, from what I understand, locked in for 2020 into ISM Raceway near Phoenix. So while Steve O'Donnell came out and said, our intention is to keep it there for a couple years, Mike Helton and Julie Giese. So Mike Helton, NASCAR's vice president, Julie Giese, the president of ISM Raceway, both came out at their press conference at the track and said it's only locked in for 2020. So I think that that's interesting, starting with the last race of the season, that NASCAR is looking at possibly doing a rotation where it's a little bit more akin to the Super Bowl. Now, obviously, NASCAR's a little bit limited potentially because right now they're holding that in mid-November, and it's cold in a lot of places in mid-November, at least cold enough where you don't want to have a race and try and bring, at least 50,000 people or what have you. So I think it's interesting to see what they can do from there, and whether, in 2021 they bring that back to ISM Raceway, or whether they really start a rotation like that. You look at the Martinsville night race. I mean, clearly that's something that fans, I think, have been asking for. They're kind of going back to Saturday night short track racing, and that's the first time they've ever had that there with the Cup race. So I think that was kind of an easy one for them to do. Remember, they couldn't add or subtract any tracks in 2020. That starts in 2021. In 2016, their 5-year track sanction agreement started that goes through 2020. So they had one arm, tied behind their back for this schedule, in terms of they could only really shuffle the deck. They couldn't really add or subtract. So you had to move like Martinsville night race. It's still the same track, and obviously you still want to have Martinsville, but just change it to a night race. Pocono doubleheader. I think that's one of the more fascinating ones. There's talk that NASCAR in the future, whether it's 2021 or maybe more like 2024, when the TV deal ends, depending on who you talk to, could go down to as little as maybe 28 races. It's possible in 2021 they might only go down to 34, or maybe they keep it the same. It's tough to tell. You get different answers from different people because the problem is their TV deal goes through 2024. So that complicates NASCAR's ability to unilaterally just say we're going down to 28, 30 races. But NASCAR definitely wants to kind of quicken up this schedule. Steve Phelps, the president of NASCAR, I remember specifically last year at his State of the Sport press conference at Homestead Miami Speedway, he kind of said our gloriously long schedule when he was talking about the schedule. And he was kind of being tongue in cheek, as if to say, like, hey, guys, I know our schedule is long as heck. It's basically 10 months. So I think, you look at the Pocono doubleheader, that's them trying to speed up the season. Now, obviously, I think the schedule only ends up ending 1 week earlier, in part because they take 2 weeks off for the Olympics, 2 Sundays off in a row for the Olympics for the Cup Series. But there's no doubt that they're looking at trying to speed up the schedule and get away from the NFL. They see the NFL and the start of the NFL season in college football as well as something that, but obviously particularly the NFL, because a lot of the races are on Sunday, they see that as a big, drain that's siphoning off their TV viewership. So they're trying to get away from that. So I think Pocono has always kind of been the guinea pigs of NASCAR scheduling. They totally embrace it. They legitimately are excited about this. I legitimately believe that they wanted to do this because they do accept that role and they like that role. But I think that this is a kind of a guinea pig hamster wheel type experiment to see if NASCAR can duplicate this in a big way, starting in 2021 or in the couple years after that. So I think that was a interesting one. Obviously, the Daytona IMS swap got a lot of attention. I've seen, folks from Daytona say that they feel like this is just, first and foremost, they weren't selling out that July race. So they didn't, there's a reason the Daytona 500 stay the same. ISC and NASCAR feel like the Daytona 500 is working. 4 consecutive grandstand sellouts. Yes, it's less seats than they had before, but for the 101,000 seats they have now, almost 102,000, they're selling out. So they're not going to mess with that. They're going to keep that as the first race, as we saw. But, their July race was not selling out. It was doing okay, but they felt like they could possibly tweak it and get some better results. And from the on-track point, they're saying like, hey, look, this is going to potentially be insane, in the sense that a guy who might have had no chance at the playoffs at even a short track, let alone a 1.5 miler, now might be able to win their way and do something crazy at Daytona plate race. And obviously they're getting rid of plates, but you guys know what I mean, to try and get into the playoffs. So they think that's going to add some drama. With IMS, and the Brickyard, I think at this point they're just trying anything. Obviously, clearly it's just you can't hold a race there even 100,000 people there doesn't look great, and they're clearly getting a third of that right now, or maybe a half. So they're just trying anything with that, and so that just kind of got shuffled, and we'll see how that goes. I'm sure IMS and everyone there is going to work really hard to try and make that a success. But it's just clearly, I think it's an interesting idea because you put the patriotism around the event. It's NASCAR, July 4th. We'll see how it goes. I didn't think it was great to hold an event during a Colts game. So I think getting away from the NFL season, even though it's going to be 180 degrees in Indianapolis that day, most likely, we'll see how it goes. Obviously they added some short tracks to the playoffs with Bristol. So yeah, they're just kind of, again, kind of shuffling the deck, doing what they could, starting to lay the groundwork for 2021 in ways like moving the finale away from Homestead and starting to possibly start a rotation there. So I think they were kind of laying the foundation for 2021 and at the same time trying to make some tweaks where they could to, just freshen things up. Well, I guess the one other one to hit on would be, obviously going straight to the West Coast now after the Daytona 500. Atlanta, obviously being in Atlanta during the winter, it just wasn't working. So that's another one where they're like, hey, just trying to get a little bit smarter, put it into the spring as opposed to the winter, and just do things that can maybe shake things up and give these dates some new energy.
Another one of the major talking points, we've talked a lot about 2021. This is a super chat from Big Blue Attack, and I think it fits in really well here. He wants to know about the Nashville fairgrounds. What is it going to take to get a deal done for a Cup Series race there, or is that even a realistic possibility at this point?
I absolutely think it's still realistic. Clearly, as we've seen some of the reporting from the Nashville Tennessean in the last week, which they had a great piece about this. There's some legitimate challenges there, and it always seemed like there could be because obviously, the good news is that they're trying to develop this track, not in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it's in legit Nashville, but at the same time, they're building an MLS stadium right there. And so the fact that they're going to have this potential kind of mixed use development with soccer fields and an apartment and things like that right by the entrance of the stadium. I was talking to a track executive who's not necessarily working directly on this, but is familiar just with track operations. They work in that industry. And I asked them if kind of that mixed use development, which apparently is at the entrance of where the track would be, if that's a deal breaker or if it's just some heartburn. And they said somewhere in the middle. So these are some legit concerns that they're going to have to try and figure out. And at the same time, they're going to have to put up some of their own money, I think. I think you're going to have to see SMI put up some of their own money to get these renovations done. I don't think the city is going to just do this all themselves. You saw in that, for those who read the Tennessean article, they noted that I think the spokesperson for the mayor said that they haven't seen any like quote serious offer or legitimate offer yet or something along those lines that indicated that financially they haven't seen an offer they like yet. So presumably, if SMI had just come in and said, hey, we'll just do this all ourselves, I don't think the city would be saying they don't like the offer yet or they haven't seen an offer they want yet. So presumably if they haven't, that means that, SMI at this point, or at least as the last time of those negotiations, maybe wasn't offering to put up as much money as they could yet. So I think you're going to have to see them step up with some of their money. And I'm sure they're offering some, but maybe not enough currently to what led to some of those comments that made people question, the status and progress of those negotiations. So, I definitely wouldn't doubt Marcus Smith's ability to get this done. I mean, clearly they've made some legitimate progress to get to where they are right now, which is, short of a deal with the city, but clearly at a point where it's public, it's out there, it's known that they're working towards one to see if it's possible. So, they're definitely not 100% of the way there, but they're definitely not 0% of the way either. I mean, they've made some legitimate progress here. Let's be clear. So I do think it's possible. I also think from what I'm hearing that it is possible it doesn't get done. So, it's just kind of in the air right now. If you talk to Marcus Smith and somehow got him to tell you, what he really thought, could he tell you with like 80% confidence? Maybe, but he's not going to reveal that right now publicly, whether he thinks it's really going to work or not. So it's just kind of reading the tea leaves. And right now the tea leaves are showing that, it looks like there's a chance, but also there's some legitimate opposition and hurdles they're going to have to clear that are not super easy and not super unilateral. So they're going to have to, in the sense that they're asking for some kind of zoning changes with that mixed use development. And apparently that's already been passed. And apparently it was a very long, elongated process with like the city council and everyone involved to get that passed. So they would kind of have to go back and change those plans. So can SMI get that done? I definitely think it's possible. And we're trying to stay on top of it and figure out how close they are or aren't. But as of right now, I really don't have a huge update as far as anything beyond what we've kind of read publicly.
SMI, that's a good transition as well because they didn't necessarily have the greatest weekend last weekend. I think it would be fair to say the Bristol crowd was not TV friendly. Let's put it that way. What kind of can we gain from that, or what have they kind of been saying about the crowd itself? Because there really wasn't a weather excuse this year. It just did not look very TV friendly.
No, I mean, I don't think there's much you can say. I mean, obviously, I don't think anyone's expecting Bristol to sell 160,000 seats for their spring race anymore. But there's a difference between, 70, 80, 90, and when you're having to ask yourself whether it's like 20, 30, or 40, and so it doesn't matter what it is. It's nothing personal about SMI. Any person who owns a venue with 160,000 seats and you can only get 30 to 40,000 folks out there, it's going to look bad. I mean, it's just the way it is. There's no spin in that. I don't think there's anyone from SMI who's trying to spin that. I'm sure they're very displeased, both from what I would just think and from some things I've heard. Clearly they're not happy at all about this. It's a very bad development to have a race like that where, you have that many empty seats. So, it's just like the Brickyard 400s. That's why people think the Brickyard 400 could go away eventually, because it's just not tenable to have that many empty seats for an event. I mean, that's, it's just not. So I don't know what necessarily Bristol would tell you or what SMI would tell you about their number one reason or scapegoat for why this happened. Clearly there's kind of macro reasons that have to do with the sport. I'm not familiar with whether they promoted the race enough. Hopefully they did, but that could be a case where maybe they need to market it differently or market a little bit better. I saw someone say that the night race that's coming up in a couple of months has already sold more seats than this one did last weekend. So on one end, that's a good sign for the night race that it's already sold more seats and still a couple months out. So hopefully that one's better attended, but there's definitely no way you could really spin that crowd. And it's a whole sports issue. I mean, certainly it's SMI's issue to deal with, but it's NASCAR's issue to deal with as well. And so, I think the sport just, it got exposed a little bit there with some of those attendance challenges. When you have 40, 50,000 seats at some of these tracks, you only have to bring out 35, 40,000 to make it look good, or at least make it look decent. But when you have 160,000 seats and you get the same crowd there with 40, 50,000 people, maybe 30, whatever it was in that range, it's just going to look really bad. So in terms of what's the long-term direction, I mean, it's kind of shocking to think that Bristol could lose a race because everyone wants to go in direction of more short tracks. But obviously, I think that's not tenable long-term. So just like I think the Brickyard 400's future is in doubt after 2020, I'm not saying it's going away because I think it's a race that NASCAR, they like that history of going to IMS. But at some point, if, the Brickyard 400 can't work under any circumstances and bring out a decent crowd, that race could go away. And I would say the same thing with the Bristol Spring Race. I think if there's no fixing that, I just don't think anyone involved will have the appetite long term to want to keep seeing that. So I haven't heard any spinning from anyone involved. I think everyone acknowledges that was a unacceptable crowd, and I think you'll see them probably make changes as soon as 2021 if that's not fixed.
I did see one bit of spin. It was not coming from people who were officially with NASCAR or with SMI, but I did see a bit of a narrative forming that the hotels were too expensive.
Yes, that was definitely out there. Yeah, I think the thing about the thing about hotels is it's definitely legitimate to say that a hotel that's usually $100 or less, when it goes to 350 or 300, that's not ideal. But I don't think it's a real, legitimate thing to say in terms of that kept 50,000 people away. I mean, I just don't think that's the case. And I think certainly if it kept a couple hundred or a couple thousand people away, maybe, then that's not ideal. But the attendance there was far short of, it was tens of thousands away of what people would have wanted to see as a minimum crowd, to make it look decent, and I just don't think that, because the thing about hotel price gouging is it's not new, so the fact that it's not new, I mean, it's been going on for years. I would assume it went on in the best days of NASCAR. So I'm not saying that hotel price gouging is a good thing or that it no impact, but I don't think anyone can seriously say that that's why tens of thousands of people weren't there.
I don't have a whole lot to talk about on the F1 side, though there was something I wanted to ask you about. Was we've heard rumors pretty much since the start of the year that Liberty Media, who of course is an American company, and that's kind of one of the reasons it's kind of important to talk about them, is they're looking at possibly selling Formula One after just a couple of years of ownership. I mean, what have you heard on that front? Is there a possibility that this could happen anytime soon? And what kind of entity would take over if Liberty Media does indeed get out of the sport?
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly seen kind of some of those reports. It's tough to say at this point. I mean, you've tried to talk to Formula One about it and Liberty Media about it, and they seem to have no interest in commenting in any shape or form. Certainly when you talk to some people kind of like F1's PR department, they're kind of denying it. But certainly those rumblings are out there to an extent, I think, and it's definitely something to keep an eye on. I mean, obviously, Liberty just bought in about 2.5 years ago, so the fact that they would be looking to offload some shares, I think, if that is the case, it would be a case of this thing ended up being way more complicated than they expected. As we know, they have a couple months to pass the Concord Agreement, or otherwise they're going to run afoul of FIA regulations for starting in 2021. So I think it's just proven to be a very complicated arrangement, but that doesn't mean that I'm able to confirm yet that they're definitely trying to sell it. I haven't been able to confirm that. Again, those rumblings are out there, some that have been published, some that I've heard from people in the industry, but it's tough to say at this point if it's definitely happening, just because I haven't been able to confirm it. So I haven't been able to fully. There's definitely people out there who think there might be something to it. And there's some people who are pretty connected who think there is nothing to it. So at this point, I'm kind of hearing conflicting information, unfortunately, and that's why I haven't really addressed it a lot recently, because there's not a lot to address when you can't prove it or disprove it at this point on my end. So we're certainly keeping an eye on it. And if they were to get rid of it, I mean, it could be to another media company, I think, clearly. You look at a company like NBC Universal Comcast, I mean, they have a lot of money, so that's the sort of company that could possibly, if they want to take a swing at it, could do something like that. But, it's certainly something to keep an eye on, certainly something we're kind of continuing to try and dig in on. But it's just tough to say right now with any definitive notion, because I haven't been able to get that sort of intelligence. So, yeah, it's obviously would be a huge deal if they're getting out after just 2 or 3 years. Even if they were only selling us a significant stake, that would be obviously huge news. So something to keep an eye on, but just tough for me right now to say if it's definitely happening.
One of the hot button issues we always have on the business side of racing is TV ratings, or our TV ratings. One of the things that I found incredibly interesting, and only a few sources have really talked about it, are that at the moment, Formula One is crushing IndyCar in the TV ratings department, which is fascinating to me, considering how much media attention, coverage, and seemingly fan interest IndyCar has versus Formula One on this side of the pond, and yet TV numbers don't seem to show that.
Well, the thing about it, I will say that I'm trying to keep in mind, and I've talked to some people about this, and look, I mean, the numbers are good for Formula One right now, but I'm not saying that they're, through the roof better than they were when they were on NBCSN, but they are all on ESPN, ESPN2 right now. So, I mean, those are channels that, a lot of people throughout the country just leave on all day long. That's kind of, you have to go to any kind of college, dorm. You're just going to see people leave their ESPN on all day, things like that. ESPN2 a little bit less, and a good bit of their ratings or races are on ESPN2. So definitely credit to Formula One. I think they have some decent ratings. I don't think they're as strong as what Formula One would want in the U.S., given that they're, usually 500,000 to 700,000 people race in a country with, 300 some million people. But they're decent. And yeah, I think obviously IndyCar has some work to do. There's no question about it. Hopefully their ratings are a little bit stronger when they get on NBC eventually. Obviously, it's a little bit unfortunate that this weekend that NBC has enough conflicts. NBC Sports has enough conflicts where they couldn't put Long Beach on the big NBC network. It's still on NBCSN. So yeah, I think clearly there's no kind of, we talk about no spinning with like Bristol's crowd. Obviously, I think there's no spinning with, less than 300,000 people for barbers, not necessarily ideal. But at the same time, I mean, that's not an event that's kind of, a new event within the last decade. I mean, that's not kind of a tentpole event of IndyCar. So I wouldn't look too far into last weekend, but I think overall, certainly IndyCar still has a long way to go, for sure. I think Mark Miles would be the first one to tell you that. And again, I'm sure they're going to hope for some of these tentpole events like Long Beach this weekend. That's certainly a race that usually brings a lot more people. Obviously, in terms of viewership, and certainly, you start talking about the races they'll have on network TV. Obviously, you're going to have some apples to oranges situations develop there where we're going to be comparing races that were on NBCSN last year, maybe, or things like that, to ones that will now be on big NBC. So it won't be a full fair comparison year over year. So we're going to have some situations like that. But certainly, I think everyone, of course, is the big one we're watching is Indy 500, and that will be a fair comparison because you're talking about two networks that are on broadcast TV between ABC and NBC. So yeah, I'm sure, that's kind of the big one. I think that's the big gauge, so I'm not overreacting too much right now to some of these viewership numbers. If you look at Supercross, they switched from Fox to NBC this year, and their viewership is off like 20 to 25%, like significant drop. So sometimes these things just happen when you switch in your first year and so, yeah, I think IndyCar still has a lot of work to do, and Formula One's probably feeling good. Yeah, when they beat IndyCar, I think for sure. But again, the big one I'm watching is going to see how the race performs versus ABC last year when we talk about the Indy 500.
Yeah, I think that's what everybody's going to be. I mean, that's got to be what they're waiting for. And I think, I mean, again, I don't want to put too much of my opinion in this because it's not about me, but boy, oh boy, I really think they failed on NBC, and IndyCar kind of failed in the first kind of weeks of this partnership not to get a race prior to the Indy 500, or the month of May, I should say, because the Grand Prix is on NBC. But I think they really missed it by not having either St. Pete or Long Beach or anything on the big NBC before the month of May.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating point. I mean, I remember speaking with Jim McKellian, the CEO of Long Beach, last year, and at that time he was pushing to try and get this race on NBC. And gosh, I forget exactly. It's not the Masters, of course, because the Masters is on CBS, I believe. But there's something on NBC on Sunday. I forget exactly what it is. Shame on me. That just was some sort of conflict they couldn't get past. So here we are. It is what it is, and obviously it's not ideal to not be the number one sport. Because when you're number one, of course you're going to get everything. But that doesn't mean IndyCar is not a great sport. It is. So it just kind of is what it is. But I think obviously, clearly, I think you're onto something to an extent. You'd like to probably have one race that was on network by now. I don't think many people at IndyCar would deny that. So definitely a fair point, I think, David. But kind of, they're working. And, I think next year they'll probably try and see if they can improve this a little bit. But I think by and large, I mean, this race, as far as Long Beach, that one in particular, that's been on the same weekend for decades. So you got to keep that date equity over moving to network TV, I think, in this case. But whether, St. Pete, a race like that could have ended up on NBC. I forget exactly what was on NBC that day. So, you may be on something there for sure, that they had a couple other opportunities where they could have done it.
That is also an interesting dichotomy we've kind of seen in American motorsports. While IndyCar's TV ratings have been, let's just say, dismal, and NASCAR seems to have stabilized on the TV ratings front, we see the opposite when you talk about track attendance. Obviously, we mentioned it about Bristol, but if you look at Barber, which is only a couple 100 miles away, the place looked packed. So why has IndyCar kind of become a destination series where people are willing to spend hundreds of dollars to go see them, while NASCAR seems to be more of a TV-only product now?
David, you just brought up an excellent point. Like, I've thought about doing stories on this. In fact, I've brought up to my editor before. It's never exactly worked out, but I'm telling you, it's something I think about all the time. You use the perfect word, the dichotomy between IndyCar and NASCAR, where NASCAR still has, relatively speaking, great TV ratings and great TV viewership, and yet they're struggling with attendance. And with IndyCar, it's the exact opposite. IndyCar is having this renaissance with attendance. It's just not as quite as much in ratings. And so, I really don't know the exact reason why. I mean, but I will say, what the point you just brought up is something that should be written about and talked about more, because it is a fascinating dichotomy. You can just look at this past weekend as a great example. I mean, IndyCar got 296,000 viewers, NASCAR got 2.8 million, and Barber had a respectable crowd, and obviously, Barber's a spread out road course, so it's different. Let's be fair to Bristol, but clearly, for what the races are, Bristol did not have a good attendance. So, gosh, I wish I had the exact answer. Why it is the case. I mean, clearly, NASCAR has kind of always been the somewhat of the bigger motorsport in America. Obviously, we could talk about the split in open wheel racing, how that affected it. Obviously, before that split, they were kind of on a similar plane, similar level playing field with NASCAR. Obviously, had some huge crowds, huge attendance, and huge TV ratings at that time as well. So, obviously the split kind of affected, I think it's kind of I guess maybe is the easy answer as to why it really hurt IndyCar's TV ratings. And they haven't, I guess, been able to recover ever since. But there's no question that they're seeing, you talk about like Road America. I mean, just fantastic crowds that have been out there in recent years for IndyCar. So they're having this kind of, and then obviously the Indy 500, the big one. I mean, they've had a renaissance there with attendance too, back to 300,000 regularly and 350,000 for the 100th run a couple of years ago. So it's just a fascinating notion, and I think it should be talked about more. I think you bring up a great point.
Well, I appreciate that. I guess we'll transition fully to IndyCar now. One of the big talking points recently has been 2021 or 2022, now that we've started to hear some things from Jay Fry, the new engine formula. You yourself have reported that there's potentially a third manufacturer of German heritage coming in. Others have reported a little more favorably. I remember Marshall Pruitt specifically saying that a third manufacturer was, quote, a slam dunk. Where is IndyCar right now in those negotiations with a third manufacturer, and is it a slam dunk in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think they're having a lot of talks with OEMs. You've seen Jay Fry come out before and say that, hey, look, I've had some verbal agreements that, verbal agreement's a big deal. It's not a signed contract. That's only a signed contract is a signed contract, but a verbal agreement is a pretty big development. And for Jay Fry to come out before and say that he's had a couple of those with OEMs fall through, I think that's a pretty interesting notion about how complicated these deals are. So until they get that deal signed, I think anything can fall through, because these manufacturers, I mean, these are just such gigantic decisions, and it's tough to make these deals come to life, and it's a lot easier sometimes to just pull the plug if someone internally doesn't like it. So I definitely think, with all that being said, that IndyCar appears to be making some very legitimate progress. I certainly think if Marshall is saying that he feels like it's a slam dunk, then that's a big deal, But at the same time, on my end, I mean, we've certainly reported what we could. I'm trying right now to kind of advance my reporting, and there's just a lot of kind of ducks I got to get in a row before I can kind of add reporting on what we've put out right now. So I think definitely they're in stages where they're in some sort of advanced talks with some OEMs, at least one, if not multiple. Working hard to try and be able to identify that for folks publicly. But it's just there's a lot of you talk about politics and things like that could come into play. And, it's just I'm trying to get my ducks in a row on that before I can kind of put, more out there about what we're hearing and what we're able to confirm. But certainly it seems like they are having some, quite legitimate progress at trying to land an OEM. Like you said, could be for 2022 at this point, as opposed to 2021, which was what we had been hearing for months. So that's something to keep an eye on as well. But no question that the buzz appears to be legit. Just because the buzz is legit in terms of the notion that they're making some very serious progress doesn't mean it's going to turn into a done deal. So I can't say that yet on my end. I mean, I think, I take other people at their words. And if Marshall Pruitt is saying it's a slam dunk, I think that's a great indication that he's hearing that they're making some very serious progress as well. And maybe he's ready to go as far as say it's a done deal, So We'll just have to see what other reporters say. That's why I was mentioning earlier. I mean, other reporters in IndyCar and across motorsports do a great job. I'm not the only one who has information or breaks news. There's other people who have great information, and I think Marshall does a great job. So I would take that at face value for sure. And again, on our end, we've reported that they've had some good discussions with a German OEM, and we're working hard to advance that and get more information out for everyone, and we'll do that as soon as possible.
So looking a little closer to the present day, we've always, especially on this channel, we cover a lot of the Indy 500 entry list. It looks like it's going to be pretty big this year. And we were just talking before we went on the air that we both kind of got blindsided by Andretti's going to announce a sixth driver tomorrow in Long Beach. You hadn't heard anything about this yet, had you?
Quite frankly, I hadn't. And this is just, maybe some insight for your viewers. There's just so much going on right now in the business side of motorsports that I don't know when I came. This is my 5th year covering racing, and I don't know when I came to the realization, but at some point in the past couple of years, you come to the realization that you can't get everything. You just can't. There's just literally no way. You can try and come close, and that's a goal, just like it's a goal for a batter in baseball to try and hit as much as they can, but you're not going to get them all. You're not going to bat 1,000%. And some of these kind of, some of the last guys in the field for the Indy 500, I just haven't been able to devote a lot of time to it. So that one caught me off guard. I'm fascinated to hear who it is like everyone else. I'll try and do some digging tonight and see if I can figure it out before they put it out there. But clearly it's going to come out tomorrow anyway. So we're all going to find out soon. Obviously, we know some of the names who we think it could be possibly, Carlos Munoz, maybe Stephen Wilson. Did they find a way to put that together? I don't know. But those seem like some of the names you would think that would be possibilities. I saw your Twitter account throw out J.R. Hildebrand as well. That would be fascinating. We saw, I think we saw on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, him retweet something with Salesforce. And of course, they've been his sponsor before. So, maybe it's with them in Salesforce. Who knows? That would be a great one. That's a brand who I know that people in IndyCar are trying to bring into a much greater extent than just a one-off. That's obviously one of the biggest companies that's based in Indianapolis. So definitely some interesting possibilities about who it could be. And I'll try and figure it out and see if I can get out there early. But clearly, we're going to find out within 24 hours or not, or less. And I'll be interested to hear what your thoughts are on it as well.
Yeah, that was something that was thrown at me on Twitter. And quite honestly, looking at how Andretti has structured their team specifically for this year, I thought it makes total sense. They seem to be going all in on the All-American drivers. Andretti generally doesn't pick drivers that don't have a chance to win the race. Hildebrand fits that description. We've seen in the past that he's been a front runner virtually every year he has shown up at the Indy 500 and was one turn away from winning it in his first year. And to the other point is that it's kind of gone quiet on the Dreyer and Reinbold front. We don't know if they're going to enter a second car. So
that's right.
There's a possibility that he could have brought that Salesforce money to Andretti, and Michael's never been one to turn down a money if it's green. So,
well, and also, I mean, the prospect of sparking a relationship with Salesforce is a pretty big deal as well. I mean, Dreyer and Reinbold do a great job, but they're kind of course, pretty much, they've had some aspirations to add some races. And I saw Sage Karam say earlier this week that he has some news to share as well. I tried to look into that and was basically told, just wait, we'll let you know when we're ready. But so I don't know if they're adding some races, but clearly, they're not as legit an outfit as Andretti Autosport. And so for Andretti, if they have the prospect of getting with Salesforce, that would be a great partner to try and, bring in for the Indy 500 and try and incubate a partnership with long term. Because, gosh, any partner, that's a team that's a brand that F1 teams would love to have. I mean, that's a great company, So if you could get them as a partner, that's a big deal. Even if it's as a one-off. A guy like Michael Andretti and his team, their CMO, Doug Bresnahan, they're going to see that as a great opportunity to try and incubate a relationship with a huge company based in Indianapolis that they can try and get to, go in a bigger way, hopefully, eventually.
Well, yeah, it's real easy to kind of invite the CEOs and the higher ups at Salesforce to the Christmas party when you're both based in Indianapolis, like Salesforce and Andretti Autosport are. It's a 10-mile drive from downtown to Zionsville where their shop is.
Exactly.
It makes total sense. I guess we'll move on to kind of the big story for the Indy 500. And he's pretty much been the big story for the Indy 500 for the last 3 years, and he wasn't in the race last year. Fernando Alonso tested at Texas Motor Speedway this week. But one of the major talking points, one of the things that I talked about, one of the things that you have been reporting on is the sponsorship on the side pod of that car. Now, it's nothing new that we've seen e-cigarette vape sponsors before in IndyCar. In fact, just as few as 3 years ago, we had Mystic on the side of Sebastian Bourdais' car. But this is the first time we've seen a Surgeon General's warning on the side of a race car. I was fascinated to find out whether or not they were preemptively trying to make sure that their sponsorship was within the bounds of the law, or if this is a newer regulation that that if you are running a brand that has a significant percentage of nicotine in it, that you're now required to put that on the side of the car. Because when Blue and Mystic were running, we did not see anything like that on those cars, or certainly the cigarette companies as well that preceded them.
Yeah, and if memory serves, at Bahrain, they had a British American Tobacco brand Vipe on there. That didn't have that either. So, I'm talking, hopefully, from what I believe, to Zach Brown and their U.S.-based salesman, Ben Priest, McLaren, tomorrow. So I'll try and get that clarified. I'm not exactly sure. What I can say is I spoke with IndyCar, and they said that under the terms of the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement that was started in, I think, 1998. Now, maybe it's been updated since then, but that's when it was originally struck. E-cigarettes and vapor products, the companies prefer to call them vapor or smokeless products. They're kind of also referred to as e-cigarettes, are not banned from that list of kind of things that they can't do, they can't advertise in sports marketing. So because they're not banned, IndyCar says they reviewed this on a case-by-case basis and that this was within the rules, and so they approved it. And I don't know why that kind of notion with the, like you said, with the Surgeon General warning is on there. I'll see if I can figure that out tomorrow. But I think the more interesting, bigger thing for me is just, to your point, while this isn't brand new to have e-cigarette sponsors or vapor product sponsors on a car in IndyCar, I do think we're starting to see a little bit of a trend overall with some of the major players who sometimes, you talk about guys like RJ Reynolds, they built kind of, with Winston racing tobacco sponsorships. They're coming back in and they're doing it with reduced risk products and campaigns. So you talk about Philip Morris International with Mission Winnow. They're spending a lot of money on that. I mean, the title sponsorship of Ferrari and Ducati has got to be a combined, $30 million minimum, if not 50, so these are gigantic commitments that these guys are saying, hey, look, we've kind of found a way to come to advertise either reduced risk campaigns or reduced risk products back into motorsports. And so I think it's a fascinating notion. We're diving into it deeper. We're looking at doing a story on it here at the Sports Business Journal for our magazine. So it's definitely something I think to keep an eye on. And I'm going to talk again more to McLaren tomorrow about this, but I think clearly, for them, they see they're there to sell advertising. Their car is a giant billboard, and so as long as they're doing things legally, of course, it's absolutely fair game for them to go chase companies like British American Tobacco, who is not only advertising some of their products like Vipe and Views with their sister company RJ Reynolds, but also are doing it for their A Better Tomorrow campaign, which is a kind of a overall marketing campaign about how they're transitioning. I spoke with a spokesperson, I'll just add this briefly, from Philip Morris International today, and I learned some interesting stuff about the whole Mission Winnow thing that I think is fascinating. A couple things I'll say right now. First and foremost, they have no plans to do anything with products with Mission Winnow. So as long as what they're saying is correct, you're not going to see them advertise one of their e-cigarette or vapor products. It's only going to be about kind of this overarching campaign. How, from what they claim, they truly are trying to eventually get to a day where they no longer sell cigarettes. Also, what I thought was fascinating is I asked the spokesperson whether they were open to possibly expanding their partnerships, and it sounds like they are. So, could we see Mission Winnow coming into NASCAR, IndyCar in the future? I think we could.
Well, we know there are, at least on the IndyCar side, there are some previous relationships with some major teams with Philip Morris International. I think even this may not still be true, but I believe that Roger Penske either was or still is on the board of directors at Philip Morris.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. In fact, to your point, I first and foremost, I agree that I don't remember either if he still is, but he definitely at least was. And when it was the Penske's 50th anniversary a couple of years ago, we actually did a whole section on that. And I actually got to speak to, I did basically a profile on their sponsorship approach and how they've been doing things through the years. And I actually spoke with someone who was kind of familiar with how Mr. Penske was on the Philip Morris board. And the point they made to me is like, Roger Penske knows these companies inside and out. When they become his sponsors, he learns them inside and out. So yeah, he had such a close relationship with them where they literally had them on their board of directors to make decisions about their products. It wasn't about racing. So yeah, he clearly had a very close relationship with them.
And more to the business point as well. So I actually got something wrong in my video where I talked about this sponsorship. While RJ Reynolds, and I believe this is a pretty significant point to make about this partnership, RJ Reynolds, this is their first American open wheel sponsorship period throughout any of their brands ever, as far as I've been able to tell. Obviously, they had a huge role to play both in the growth of NHRA and certainly NASCAR. But British American Tobacco actually has been involved in American open wheel racing, though never at the Indianapolis 500 because of their involvement with the Cool brand with the team we now know as Andretti Autosport. So that's something I did want to bring up. But I mean, how big is it? How significant is it for a company like this, and how involved are they? Obviously, you're going to be talking to some of the people who are involved in this tomorrow. How significant is it for British American Tobacco as well as RJ Reynolds to be involved in IndyCar, and how excited do you think they are to be here?
Yeah, I think it's a big deal for them. I think this is a huge opportunity. I mean, it kind of is like saying the sky's blue. Like the media attention Fernando Alonso has already started getting and is going to continue to get for the next month and a half is absurd. So his car is going to be absolutely everywhere. His fire suit is going to be absolutely everywhere. The media exposure is going to be through the charts. So now look, the thing is probably priced accordingly. So McLaren knows what they're doing, and they probably charge pretty nicely to get I mean, this is definitely, I know for a fact that, the sponsorship, I think in 2017, and I'm going to ask Zach this tomorrow to be sure, but I think that deal came together so quickly because it was kind of just a random thing that just happened that year where they were running poorly in F1. So Zach offered it to Fernando Alonso that I'm pretty sure they just gave some of the sponsorship to their current partners that was on the IndyCar. But, this year they had a whole year to plan for it and they sold this. So, the companies that are on this car bought this these assets to be on the car. So this is a big expenditure. I don't know exactly what it is from British American Tobacco, so that's RJ Reynolds, but it's a significant purchase. I'm sure at least in the six figures, if not into the low sevens. And so, yeah, I think that they see this as a huge opportunity. I think clearly, Juul is kind of the dominant vapor. We all know that in the U.S. So this is a chance for them to kind of fight back and gain some market share and really get their brand out there. And, of course, when it comes to these sort of companies, how they advertise and how they market is very touchy, very regulated. So we'll have to see how they advertise it, on their, any sort of social and digital channels, things like that. It, for me right now, is unclear. I am planning, based off what I've heard from McLaren, to possibly talk to someone from British American Tobacco about this as well. So hopefully I'll be able to share some more details over the coming, week or two. But I'm sure they view this as a huge opportunity to clearly align with what's going to be the most hyped car.
So we're almost right at 8 o'clock. Would you be able to stay on for just a couple more minutes to
Absolutely.
Viewers? All right, excellent. So that's open up to you in the chat, folks. You have some questions in the chat already. This comes from Steam's Dev. He asks, do you think NASCAR going back to their roots right away is a good idea? There's been a lot of debate around this. I'd love to hear your story.
I think so, by and large. I mean, you gotta, they don't want to go too much back to their roots, of course. But it depends on exactly what someone could mean in that situation. But I think by and large, absolutely. I think we've seen that with IndyCar. Going back to some of their classic tracks like Road America has been an absolute slam dunk. You talk about another slam dunk related to roots, and it's the Darlington throwback theme. I mean, whatever you think about whether, I hope most people don't think it's too corny, because I think it's pretty cool. The way some of these pit crews go all out with the retro uniforms and whatnot. But regardless of what you think, the facts are that that's been a good seller for that track. The merchandise sales for that week are off the charts. That's like, for example, Lionel Diecast. That's their best week every year at this point. That's their best race every year, is the throwback week. So I think, you talk about certain regards going back to the roots, obviously short track racing in general. That's what, of course, it's tough to fill a 160,000 seat venue, as we saw with Bristol. But in general, of course, NASCAR fans love short track racing. It's clearly, particularly now that these cars are a little bit over aeroed and over engineered, at the 1.5 mile tracks, they can't pass that much right now. So clearly short track racing is the best racing they have right now. So yeah, I think, you can overdo anything in life, but in general, I think going back to their roots is definitely the way to go about it. And of course, going back to your roots doesn't necessarily mean abandoning every market in America, west of the Mississippi. But by and large, I think going back to basics, that's something that Jim France is bringing to the table. He's kind of getting rid of things that are a little bit superfluous. Like, for example, NASCAR's not getting rid of their Go Green program, but they're not putting anywhere near the emphasis on it anymore, because they realize, like, hey guys, we got to work on attendance and ratings. That's what we do. It's an entertainment business. We're not going to spend time on going green and stuff like that. So they're getting back to basics, and some of that stuff, some of that old school stuff, NASCAR fans love, and just racing, not over engineered racing, things like that. So you talk about the schedule and trying to go back to possibly some classic venues. I mean, I think, you talk about like places like Rockingham. I mean, that might be a little bit far-fetched right now because they got a lot of work still to do. But Nashville, as we talked about earlier, that's a big part of the sport's history. So I think that's a move that clearly, you can just see if you post about Nashville, it blows up on Twitter these days. So that's something that there's clearly a lot of interest around. So in general, I think going back to the sports roots is by and large a good thing.
Sorry about the dog. I hope it didn't blow your ears out. That goes.
We're all good.
So I would just like to thank real quick Daysauce, Patrick, James, Junks, Queen, and Daryl for their super chats. They didn't ask me. Better get them in there while we got a moment. But Brett Hermson asked for both. I guess that means for you and me. Would the Indy 500 add more drivers to the field? I guess this is the eternal question of, is bump day safe?
Yeah, I would probably defer to you on that one. I mean, obviously, I think bump day is great. I mean, I love the fact that we've seen some more cars showing up in recent years, and we're back to bump day. I think it's something that should certainly remain from where I sit. But I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Oh yeah, I think it should absolutely remain. I think part of the excitement of the month of May and why it is a month in the first place is because if qualifying doesn't matter, if everybody gets in the show, why do you have 2 days of qualifying? Why do you have a week and a half of practice just to go around in a circle for a couple of laps and be guaranteed you're in the race? Every bit of the month of May matters. And I like that, like you said, I like that it's back to where it's exciting and unpredictable, and nobody's guaranteed a way in. And I'm hoping that those at IndyCar and those at IMS feel the same way. It seems like they do. So I'm not too worried about it going away.
Yeah, I thought the drama last year with Hinchcliffe was incredible. I mean, look, obviously everyone who is sympathetic for them hates that for them. It was a big deal for them to miss it. Obviously, Arrow kind of took it very well, and they kind of recovered. And I'm sure James will have a very good chance of making it again this year. But gosh, the drama that brought last year was incredible. So, you hate it for SPM or Arrow SPM now, but I think locking drivers into the field, like Roger Penske suggested. I mean, I get it. I get that sponsorship stuff, but we talked about that question one or two questions ago about, going back to the basic, going back to what fans like, going back to the old days. And yeah, I think that's bump day. You're not automatically locked into the field. And I think that's the way it should remain. But certainly Mr. Penske's opinion matters a little more than mine.
Well, I think how I would respond to Roger Penske is the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And in this case, this doesn't happen a lot to Roger Penske, but he's the few in this case. You know, if Roger Penske's car or one of his drivers misses the show, like we saw with James Hinchcliffe, I would argue it does more for the Indy 500. It generates more press, it generates more headlines, it generates more social media interaction than it would if all of his cars are in the show. I get it. It would suck for Pennzoil, or it would suck for Menards or Verizon or whichever of his sponsors wouldn't make the race. But ultimately, it gets people talking about the Indy 500. It sells tickets. It sells people to watch on TV, keep up on social media, all that good stuff. I think it's better when a big name misses the show, to be perfectly honest with you.
That's what we want to see. We want to see drama. We want to see entertainment. We want to see emotions. And we got that all last year with Hinchcliffe missing the show. So, yeah, I totally agree.
So Big Blue Attack asks another question here. Can Cup and IndyCar have a doubleheader? That's kind of one of the major topics that we didn't cover here, but I'm sure you've got some things to say about this.
Yeah, so my current understanding is that there's no advanced talks for that. So for 2020, I'm not currently expecting that at this point. I'm not ruling it out. I can tell you for a fact that IndyCar is open to it. I can tell you for a fact that they were open to it last year, and I checked back in with people who work on it this year, and they said, yep, still open to it. I just haven't heard that the talks have gone anywhere to a point where I think it's going to happen for 2020. I wouldn't necessarily rule it out yet, but I think for the future, 2021 and beyond, I certainly think it's possible. I think you just got to get some key people at NASCAR on board, and ISC or SMI. We all saw Marcus Smith already come out and say that he's open to it. So, you've got one major track operator there who's saying this is something that he would do. So I definitely think for the future, it's something that can happen. And look, could it possibly still come together for 2020? I think it's possible. It's just what I've been told is that, there's no, advanced talks right now. And it's not too late where those talks couldn't kind of heat up. I mean, it's still early enough in the year, so I wouldn't rule out 2020 right now. I just haven't been told that it's likely at this stage, but you would like to think that they try it at some point. I mean, gosh, if we go through the rest of history and never try that, I think, everyone will look back and say, gosh, this could have been a rising tide lifts all boats situations. We talk about NASCAR's attendance struggles. I mean, if you go in the right market, this could be a great way to bring in some new fans. IndyCar is willing to kind of bite the bullet and run on Friday or run on Saturday and let Cup run on Sunday. So I just got to hope, for the whole sport's sake that they try it at some point, because it seems like such an interesting idea. So obviously I don't have an opinion in the sense of I don't make any more or less money or anything like that if they do or don't try it. So it doesn't technically affect me, but I just think it's such an interesting idea that you would like to think that ultimately they give it a go. But as I said, definitely IndyCar is open to it. I think ISC, there's still some, people to kind of coax and convince there. And then SMI seems like they're open to it. So possibly 2020, but certainly 2021 and beyond, you would like to think that they're willing to give it a go. But at this stage, I just can't confirm anything, definitive, because I haven't heard that there's anything definitive to really speak of.
Okay, so we're going to do a few more questions, and then we're going to let you go, Adam. We've been very generous with your time, so I thank you for that. Des asked an interesting question that I kind of wanted to get to, because I don't think I've heard any direct numbers yet. What is IndyCar's NBC deal worth approximately? We haven't really heard a whole lot of information on that. At least I haven't.
Yeah, honestly, I don't have those exact numbers. I would say it's probably kind of in the, mid 7 to low 8 figure range, probably more so in the, mid to high 7 figure if I had to guess. So, $5 to $10 million a year is what I would guess. Maybe it's a little bit more, maybe it's like 15, 20, but I'd be shocked if it's anywhere, less than 3 or 4 or any more greater than 20. So yeah, the TV deal is not worth a huge ton of money, from what I understand. But that's in comparison. I mean, and also let's bear in mind they run, half the races that NASCAR does. So, NASCAR is getting paid a lot, but they also run a lot more content, a lot more races. So yeah, I mean, obviously you kind of get paid off your ratings to an extent. And so when you talk about how IndyCar is doing great in attendance, but having, less so in ratings, that's kind of why you translate to not making quite as much money with your TV deals. But I would stress that those are just kind of, guesstimates to an extent, based off of what I've heard from people who have tried to, kind of finagle the numbers from. But I certainly have not been able to directly confirm it and don't have a confirmed number.
Carlos asks a question, and I don't know what your knowledge base would be on this one, so I apologize if it's kind of out of what
Oh,
you
go ahead.
generally know. But can McLaren do something innovative on IndyCar? And I think what he's asking here is, what can McLaren do to their IndyCar to differentiate it from the other ones? And I don't know if you would have any insight into that. It might be a question that you might want to ask tomorrow when you talk.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and look, I mean, I think it does bring up an interesting point. I mean, the short answer is I don't know exactly. I mean, I know they have a lot of money for this race, so that's a big key. Is that I know they've had a lot of success selling this. I'm hoping to get more details about it tomorrow, but my understanding is they way over delivered from their original budget. So the amount of money they were hoping to raise, I from what I'm hearing, they got a lot more than it. So they had a lot of success selling, and as we know, that helps them pour resources into it. But yeah, I think one of the most fascinating parts about motorsports to this question is that unfortunately these teams are just a little bit too secretive. So I think at times I understand it because you can't give away trade secrets because then everyone's going to go copy you else in the garage or paddock. But at times, I think, motorsports could benefit if you want to talk about a kind of really macro perspective from kind of informing people like us more about that, So, when you hear it all the time in NASCAR and also IndyCar, I mean, they talk about their setups, but they never give you any details. So it's really tough to get that information because they keep it all as trade secrets because they're worried sick about giving up something like that when they're spending tens of millions of dollars to get just a slightest advantage. So unfortunately, I don't know exactly what their car is going to do, or how they've built their Indy car better. But obviously, they've devoted a lot of resources to it in England. They built their car there at the McLaren Technology Center. So I'm sure they were running that thing, through the wind tunnel quite often and things like that. So they have a lot of resources because they were able to raise a lot of money for this venture. So I'm sure it's going to run fast, but I just unfortunately do not know exactly what their differentiators are going to be on track because if you ask them, they're probably going to say no comment.
So this comes from WKK3. Is Richmond qualifying for NASCAR a fix in the right direction or a temporary fix after Talladega? So I think he's asking about, I believe they switched NASCAR qualifying now to 5-minute sessions only. Do you have much of a thought on the qualifying procedure for NASCAR and where it may be going?
Yeah, sort of. I saw the news today, and I mean, I don't know how it changes it drastically. I mean, it kind of cuts down the amount of time, I guess, right in the first round. So theoretically, there's less time where we're going to be sitting around saying, why is no one on the track? And things like that. But I think it might make it a little bit more chaotic, quite frankly, because there's less time now. So you would presume there's going to be more times where a lot more cars are on the track. But whether this fixes kind of that issue with multi-car qualifying that we saw, particularly kind of the second and third rounds where people are just sitting on pit road, I'm just waiting to see myself, quite frankly. I'm definitely an interested observer there. And I think, obviously it's probably not been ideal that they just continue to kind of tweak this. And it kind of seems like a never-ending tweak session of their qualifying. But I definitely understand it. I think, from a macro perspective, it's fascinating how IndyCar fans and IndyCar as a sport is very much so, hey, look, these are the rules and we're just going to stick to it. We're really not going to tweak the rules all too often. Of course, it happens sometimes. And NASCAR is the opposite. NASCAR is like, hey, look, we're in this for entertainment. This is, people might call it gimmicks or whatever they're going to do, but we're going to continue to tweak our product till we feel like we get it right. So I think obviously it's probably been a little bit elongated trying to figure out how to properly qualify and what's working and what's not. But that's NASCAR. And so I'm going to be interested in myself to see how it goes this weekend in Richmond, but not a huge amount of insight I can add about what I really think is going to happen, unfortunately.
So unless a bunch of super chats roll in, this will be the last question for tonight. Again, thanks, Adam, for sticking with us.
Yeah, no problem, brother. Appreciate it.
Do we know anything? This comes from Terrace. Do we know anything about the weight of value for one person attending versus one person watching on NBC versus one person watching on NBC Sports versus one person buying paying for NBC Gold? So I think he's asking about is there any weight between, or is there any differentiation for IndyCar valuing one viewer over another in terms of when they're looking at maybe selling sponsorship or something like that?
That's a great question. I don't think so. I think they're both important in their own right. I mean, it's just kind of what's obvious. You want to have people there to make the grandstands look good and to raise some revenue from that. But you also have to, not everyone can go to an event, so you want to do well on TV as well. So, gosh, I would be interested to hear what Mark Miles would say to that. I think it's a great question. I'm not sure I can add a ton of insight as to. I've never asked him that. I think it's a really interesting question. Maybe I'll try and ask him that in the future. But from my perspective, if I had to guess what he would say, I think he would say they're both equally important. You got to have good TV viewership. That's why IndyCar didn't go fully to like streaming. They still feel like TV linear TV, old-fashioned TV is still very important. And it is, as much as people are kind of going to streaming products and OTT products, a lot of people still watch TV. So I think that's important. Clearly, you want to have people at your events. It's a great way to supplement your revenue. So I think they're both important from my perspective. So that's a pretty bad answer because I think that's pretty obvious. But I just don't know which one they would value more. I'll try and ask them that. That's a good question.
All right, and so I think we'll end it there. Adam, let them know where they can find you across the net and across print, traditional media, I guess you could say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So sportsbusinessjournal.com is our website. So, we're covering the business side of pretty much every sport, even into our cover next week is WWE. So we cover everything. We cover esports. We obviously cover stick and ball and motorsports. So Sports Business Journal is where my work primarily is. And usually as far as social media, I'm just using Twitter. And that's twitter.com/A_12.
All right, and I got to tell you, you just mentioned the wrestling. I was at WrestleMania last weekend.
How was that?
Crap! I couldn't believe it. It was unbelievable. I mean, I've been to the Indy 500, so I'm a little bit spoiled. I mean, that to me is number one, far and away on the sporting event spectrum. But I would say that WrestleMania was probably number two in terms of just the spectacle. The crowd energy was unbelievable there. It was crazy.
It looked like an insane event from what I saw. And then I saw Dale Jr., I think, was either at it or he was watching, and he tweeted like, wow, what an incredible crowd. So I think he probably made some NASCAR people squirm tweeting incredible crowd after Bristol was a couple hours earlier. But, oh, well.
Yeah, I did take a pot shot at Bristol on social media, too. I took a picture of the crowd. I was like, this ain't Bristol. I'm sure I make a lot of friends on social media.
10-4.
But thank you so much, Adam, for coming on. Be sure, seriously, folks who are tuning in, let's see how many people are actually still watching this right now. If I can get those numbers up. We've still got 151 people watching. I think it peaked around 300 live viewers. So that's pretty awesome. Thank you guys all for tuning in. Be sure to leave a like on this video if you did enjoy it. Be sure to stay tuned for This Week in Racing on Friday. Adam has clearly pointed out that there's going to be a lot of stuff to talk about on Friday. So we're going to be hitting it pretty hard. And obviously, be sure to go follow Adam Stern across his reach because he's a fantastic reporter. And I, once again, will thank you so much for coming on. I think a lot of people have enjoyed this discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. So again, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, and we will see you in the next video.